Well, last week we left this burning question on the table. What has happened to the legacy of the many women who flood the pages of Scripture? First off, we know that these stories are recounted in ancient texts that we refer to as the Bible. There are a collection of 46 books, and they were written between 1250 BCE up to 90 CE. So these all have been written between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. The final assembly was approved at around 400 CE, and there has been no additional writings added to this collection of books since that time. However, there have been many translations, and those translations at times have definitely changed the meaning of some of the texts. All the writings of the texts are by men. We don't have a single writing in Scripture that comes from a woman's perspective. The cultural influence is that of the Israelites. They believed they had the one true God. But of course, there were many other civilizations during this time that also believed they had the one true God. There are many, many ancient writings, such as those from Homer and Sophocles, Aristotle and Plato, but none of them have had the widespread recognition or influence that the Bible has had. And because this has been our source of reference for so many decisions that have been made through the ages, we need to consider the impact it has had and continues to have on the societies in which we live. Now, the focus of our discussion the past few weeks has been on how the Bible has impacted our perspective of women, their roles, and their identity. So, as we have seen, as we've talked about the various books in Scripture, there are some distinct differences that have surfaced on how women are perceived and acknowledged between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The differences are directly attributable to the influence of the star of the New Testament, who is Jesus. Now, the Old Testament portrayal of women shows them as possessions, disposable entities. They're restricted in their activities, and they're perceived as evil and treacherous. The New Testament perception and portrayal of women in their relationship with Jesus shows them as equals, essential to the spread of the new movement that eventually evolved into a new religion. Leaders of churches and communities, and highly respected in both. However, it is undeniable that this New Testament identity has eroded. In spite of the fact that Christians around the world will swear that they are followers of Jesus, too many of the lessons he taught were quickly dismissed. A reversion to Old Testament ideas and directives quickly came back into place. The voices of our scriptural women, well, they may have been heard at one time in history, but they've been too often silenced since. Today's Me Too movement may not be a religious movement, but I can honestly say that religion is at the base of that movement. Because in today's society, women are still considered possessions, disposable, and better in positions of non-authority. Some things haven't changed a great deal. So how do we become so connected to our roots as Christians and the teachings of the person we consider our leader? Well, we're going to step back a few hundred years and take a look at that. We're going to trace another movement with which we can take no pride. Now, as I start talking about some of the church history, what we need to remember is this history belongs to all Christians, not just Catholics. So when I talk about the church, I'm talking about Christianity. Remember, we didn't have a split until the early 16th century when Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses on the cathedral door in 1517. And the Eastern and Western rites didn't split off until 1054. So this history, or a good part of it, belongs to both Roman and Eastern rites alike. So we're talking about all of Christianity, all those believers in Jesus in this new movement. You'll recall in the New Testament, the love and the respect, the dignity with which women were met when encountering Jesus. They were people with whom Jesus taught and gave his most important lessons on equality and significance. And then there are those women responsible for keeping the new movement based on the teachings of Jesus moving across Europe. They were deacons, evangelists, heads of church communities, significant forces who had a huge impact on spreading the new message of salvation through Jesus. They were highly regarded people in the movement. But some interesting and very tragic things started to take place shortly after this movement began. One of the things that we see are the persecutions. Persecutions of this new movement started very, very early in their history. They happened throughout the Roman Empire, and they continue it on and off for several hundred years. Men and women were killed who refused to denounce allegiance to this movement, who refused to recognize the emperor as the all-encompassing king. This finally came to an end with the Edict of Milan in 313. So persecutions finally came to a rest. Christianity became the state religion. During the same period of time, we have multiple belief systems that are starting to take hold. Each one of these belief systems had a different perspective on who and what Jesus was and on what his teachings actually meant. There were as many as 80 different belief systems during this period of time, and these are just a few. Adoptionism said that Jesus was the adopted Son of God. He was not God the Son. Dualism told us there were two worlds, and there are two gods. One world is the world we live in. It's cruel, it's wretched, it's painful, and there's an evil God at the root of it. The other world is the world we aspire to, the world where the good and loving God is present. And then there was Docetism. Now, Docetism had two very contradictory strains to it. One said that Jesus was only a spirit, and he appeared in human form. It actually said that when Jesus walked across the sand, he left no footprints. The reason behind that, well, a God can't be killed, so Jesus could not have been a God. The other branch said that Jesus was only human and that God came into his being temporarily to do his work. And that at the crucifixion, God left Jesus. And they quote the saying that we find in Scripture from Jesus, my God, why have you forsaken me?" as proof of this, that God left this man. we have Gnosticism. Gnosticism believed that there was a whole array of secret teachings, secret knowledge that we needed to come upon in order to be saved. And that was our purpose, to seek out the knowledge that was going to save us, which we do kind of do, don't we? Okay, so on two fronts now the church is being attacked. First, we're trying to eradicate the movement altogether. Second, we have no idea what it is we supposedly believe. So obviously, there were some parameters that needed to be established regarding who and what we were. Some doctrines that we could all identify with. So early church spokesmen began speaking out against these various, what they called heresies, and setting up some of those parameters that were necessary. These people were often referred to as church doctors or church fathers. Amongst the most noted in the early church was Ignatius, Irenaeus, and Tertullian. Now, Ignatius was one of the earliest church fathers. He was born in Syria sometime between 35 and 50. He was supposedly a disciple of John the Apostle. He was a bishop of Antioch, succeeding Peter and Evodius, who died in 67. He wrote several epistles to the early church communities. He stressed the concept of an organized church structure. And he also talked about replacing the Jewish Sabbath with the day of the Lord, which would move worship from Saturday to Sunday. In letters to the communities in Ephesus, Philippi, and Antioch, he stressed the equality of men and women, especially in marriage. He talked about the holiness of virgins and widows, and he talked about the significance of Mary as the mother of Jesus. He fully understood the importance of women in the movement. Well, a little later on, we have Irenaeus. Irenaeus was born in Asia Minor about 120. He was of a Christian family. He became a priest and later a bishop in Lyon. He wrote extensively regarding the heresy of Gnosticism, and he had commentaries galore about the validity of many of the first century theologies that were going around. He was the one who was insistent that there be 4 gospels and only 4 gospels. And obviously he won out because that's what we have. In spite of the fact that there were so many other phenomenal writings in the first century that certainly could have been part of the final scriptures that we have. And Irenaeus was deemed a saint. But this sainted man had this to say about women when he was writing about a dispute that Miriam and Aaron had about their brother Moses. We remember that trio, don't we? Okay, so here is what Irenaeus had to say about this. Why was it that when Aaron and Miriam both acted with despite against Moses, Miriam alone was a judge punishment? Well, because the woman was the more culpable.
Yeah.
Yes. Both nature and the law place the woman in subordinate condition to the man. It's beginning. Then we have Tertullian. Tertullian was one of the most outspoken against the movement called Ebionism, another one of these heretical movements, according to the church fathers. He was born in Carthage about 155 CE, and he was a convert to Christianity. He is credited for over 30 different writings that covered a vast arena of early Christian theology. He was an apologist. He fiercely defended his Christian belief against the Romans. He declared Ebionism and Gnosticism as heretical, and he used numerous Old Testament writings to support his conclusions. He was a conservative. However, he was the one who originated the concept of the Trinity. That later influenced the doctrine set out by the First Council of Nicaea. So what did he have to say about women? Woman is a temple built over a sewer. Woman, you're the gateway to hell. We look at these and we have to think, we can hardly consider this anything that would be in line with what Jesus taught. Within 125 years of Jesus' death, noted leaders in the early church were denigrating women to the extreme. This set the course for all kinds of vilification of women. St. Clement of Alexandria, every woman should be filled with shame by the very thought that she is a woman. Origen, another church father, for it is improper for a woman to speak in an assembly no matter what she says, even if she says admirable things or even saintly things. That is of little consequences, since they come from the mouth of a woman. St. Augustine, bishop. What is the difference whether it is in a wife or a mother? It is still Eve the temptress that we must be aware of. I fail to see what use woman can be to man if one excludes the function of bearing children. Do we see what's happening here? By the 4th century, a fundamentally misogynistic view of women had developed, regarding them as basically a flawed version of men. Because according to theologians, Adam would never have sinned if it hadn't been for Eve. Do we all remember that story? Mm-hmm. And after all, Adam was created first anyway, right? Right. This view would be inherited into the Middle Ages and would also be combined with an idealization of what woman should be, characterized by the meek, obedient, and ever-Virgin Mary. And as we moved into the Middle Ages, we get this from Thomas Aquinas. As regards the individual nature, woman is defective and misbegotten. This is barely a sampling of quotes that come from fathers of the church, doctors of the church, and bishops. There is nothing that anybody would recognize in any of these statements that would lead us to believe these men espouse the teachings of Jesus. There is nothing here that in any way shows respect or recognition of the great women in the history of Christianity. Now, one would think that the movement to change the hypocrisy of the church that began with the Reformation in 1517 would have addressed some of the horrific transgressions against women. Well, let's see what some of the reformers have to say. Martin Luther, the word and works of God is quite clear that women were made either to be wives or prostitutes. No gown worse becomes a woman than the desire to be wise. John Calvin, I consider this was done. Oh, he is talking here now about the post-resurrection appearance of Jesus to the women, and the women go and tell the men about it, okay? So this is what he's talking about. I consider this was done by way of reproach, because the men had been so tardy and sluggish to believe. And indeed, the men deserve not only to have women for their teachers, but even oxen and asses. Yet it pleased the Lord by means of these weak and contemptible vessels, women, to give display of his power. As he recounted a section of 1 Corinthians, he has this to say: on this account, all women are born that they may acknowledge themselves as inferior in consequence to the superiority of the male sex. It goes on and on. John Wesley, founder of the Methodist movement, in a letter to his wife dated July 15th, 1774, do not any longer contend for mastery, for power, money, or praise. Be content to be a private, insignificant person known and loved by God and me. Of what importance is your character to mankind? If you was buried just now, or if you had never lived, what loss would it be to the cause of God? Unless that you think things have gotten better, let's look at the comment from Pat Robertson, Southern Baptist leader. In a fundraising letter in 1992, he says, the feminist agenda is not about equal rights for women. It is about a socialist, anti-family political movement that encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. That was in 92. Mm-hmm.
He doesn't say much better now.
Backtracking a little bit, the demonization of women was further promoted in the expulsion of women from any form of connection to church leadership. Constantine's legitimizing Christianity in the Roman kingdom caused the church to take on a new look. They developed formal protocols. Clergy were granted special privileges and given political positions. The church in Rome had taken on the Roman Empire practice of only men holding positions of authority. So we are now going back into the 4th century. The Roman practice of abstaining from marital relations to conserve energy before a battle or a sporting event found its way into religious practices. Priests were ordered to abstain from intimacy with their wives the night before they celebrated Mass. Celibacy took on the status of a special spirituality. So this began the diminishment of the influence of married priests and their wives. Pope Damasus declared that priests could continue to marry, but they were not allowed to express their love sexually with their wives. Pope Siricius actually abandoned his own wife and children in order to gain his papacy. And he immediately decreed that all priests could no longer marry. But he was unable to enforce this because it was considered way too outrageous. In 494, women's participation in the leadership of small communities came to an end when Pope Gelasius declared that women could no longer be ordained to the priesthood. This is our clearest indication that at one time women indeed did serve as priests in the church. In 1074, Pope Gregory VII legislated that anyone to be ordained must first pledge celibacy. In the year 1095, there was an escalation of brutal force against married priests and their families. And Pope Urban II, who was Pope from 1088 to 1099, ordered that married priests who ignored the celibacy laws be imprisoned for the good of their souls. He then took their wives and children and sold them into slavery. The money that was gained from this went into the church coffers. The legislation that effectively ended optional celibacy came with the Second Lateran Council under Pope Innocent II. So we now have completely eliminated any female authority or possible influence in church matters. Any reference to the contribution of women in the establishment of the church was silenced. Basically, the acknowledgement of a legacy of women was put to a torturous death by men who now took control of the institution. The New Testament teachings and ideals regarding women were eradicated, and New Testament perspective took over again. One of the most brutal assaults against women came with the witch hunts that lasted almost 300 years, beginning in about 1450. These were part of the Reformation period. Helen Ellerby, in her book, The Dark Side of Christianity, and I have that on your list of possible references, refers to this time as the end of magic and miracles. Women were again relegated to the home and the family. They had little or no authority. Control of their lives was again taken over by men. They were looked upon as more trouble than they were worth, as we've seen in many of the quotes from men who had power and influence in the Christian communities. This became the acceptable standard, even by women. Roles were established, and both men and women took on the party line. After all, this was the will of God. How do we know this? The church said so. However, even in our darkest times, the church could not completely silence or eradicate women's influence. Of the 36 doctors of the church, 4 of them are women. Saint Hildegard was a Benedictine in Germany. She was a visionary, a theologian, and a music composer. Catherine of Siena, a Third Order Italian Dominican, was a mystical author, a supporter of the Crusades, and also a consultant to the papacy. We want them, we don't want them. Saint Teresa of Avila, she was a Spanish Carmelite, a prolific spiritual and mystical writer. She was the first woman declared a doctor, but that didn't take place until 1970. Saint Teresa of Lisieux, a French Carmelite who wrote a spiritual autobiography describing her little way of spiritual perfection. Now, doctors of the church are people who are considered to have made significant contributions to the theology or doctrine of the church through their research, their study, or their writings. These women were recognized on that level. And no doubt there were many others who made significant contributions who we haven't recognized. Thousands of women throughout the centuries devoted their lives to prayer and work amongst the poor. They organized into religious orders going back into the earliest days of the church. In spite of the fact that men took control of the institution, it was women who became the hands of Jesus within the church. They built orphanages, schools, hospitals. They cared for the poorest of the poor. Many of these orders were offsprings from orders already established by men and followed many of those rules. However, they flourished in ways that male orders did not. And in part, it was because they couldn't take on positions of being spiritual leaders and distributing sacraments. This was their way of serving God's people. As an institution, the church thrived under the leadership of these women and what they did for society. But rarely were their contributions recognized or celebrated. In fact, even today, though priests are given the luxury of retirement and a pension, nuns are not. There is no institutional support of our women's religious orders. When a nun retires, she goes back to her convent, if there is one, and she is supported by the younger nuns who can still work. But unfortunately, religious orders are in crisis right now because fewer and fewer women are finding these a vocational calling. So it is becoming harder and harder for these women to support themselves. And yet the institutionalized church has not stepped in. But I digress just a bit. I could really get on a bandwagon about that one. Continually hushed under the mantle, the male mantle of institutional religion, women have nonetheless continued to pull on the strength and wisdom of early church female leaders, not just in the religious sector, but in secular life as well. The lack of rights is not just a women's issue, and more women realized that the inequities that had become so common in this white male-dominated institution had become prevalent on so many additional levels in both government and religion. One early activist in the U.S. was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was an American suffragist, a social activist, and an abolitionist. She was a leading figure in early women's rights movements. She was also one of 2 women denied participation in the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in the spring of 1840. She and the other women in attendance with her were relegated to a roped-off section out of the sight of the male participants in this convention. She was a Presbyterian. In her early years, when she started the social movement, her faith was very important to her. But eventually, she rejected all Christianity. And she said this: all religions on the face of the earth degrade women. And so long as woman accepts the position that they assign her, her emancipation is impossible. Tough words to hear. This woman never stopped working for social justice. We know Susan B. Anthony. She also was an early abolitionist along with her family. She was a devout Quaker, and like Stanton, she knew that if women were going to have a voice in enacting social justice changes, they would have to have a vote. The 19th Amendment, which finally gave women the right to vote, which passed in 1920, is often known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Harriet Tubman. She was an early abolitionist. She was a black female slave, born into slavery in 1820, finally escaping in 1849 using the Underground Railroad. And instead of running as far away as she could possibly get, she decided to go back and save others who were in a similar position that she was. She was a leading character in freeing hundreds of slaves. And she constantly credited her ability to continue fighting the atrocity of slavery to her Lord. Women of deep, deep faith. Eleanor Roosevelt. She was the longest-serving First Lady, the first presidential spouse to have regular press conferences, write a weekly column, write a monthly magazine column, host a radio talk show, and speak at a National Party convention. She advocated for the expansion of roles for women in the workplace. She advocated for civil rights for African Americans and for Asian Americans. She advocated for the rights of World War II refugees. In 1945, she became the American delegate to the newly formed United Nations. In 1946, she was elected as head of the United Nations Human Rights Commissions. In her writings, she talks about her beliefs and her prayer life. She talks about her journey from a very strict religious upbringing to a more personal faith. Betty Friedan. She was a social activist in the 1960s. She came from a relatively wealthy Jewish family, and she began to find herself more and more drawn to fighting injustices as she experienced anti-Semitism. In 1963, she wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. In there, she described the stifling roles of motherhood and child raising. She talked about women giving up college and careers to stay home and take care of family. She talked about the inequities and the difficulty in this task, and especially the extreme circumstances women would find themselves in when they became victims of divorce. She talked about the inequity of women's rights overall. These are among thousands of women in our history around the world who saw injustice and inequity in a system over which they had no control, and they went forward to do something to change it. Obviously, they weren't all that popular in their time, but that made no difference to them. After all, the first person to espouse women's rights, Jesus of Nazareth, wasn't particularly popular either. But that didn't stop him, and it didn't stop them. Jesus was considered a radical on many levels, certainly his position on women. But the early church recognized that the equality of humankind had to start with the equality of all. That was one of its pillars of strength. But that pillar was soon destroyed. Rebuilding it has been an endless struggle. Justice has been slow-moving, even in this country, where we feel that we are the most progressive in equal rights. It wasn't until 1839 that the first state granted women the right to hold property in their own name. But of course, they had to have their husband's permission to do this. 1920, women finally got to vote. It wasn't until 1963 that we actually had a law that said equal pay for equal work, no matter race, color, creed, gender. It wasn't until 2008 that we had a woman running for president. Even though other countries have seen women in top political positions all over the world, including India, Israel, Argentina, the United Kingdom, Mozambique, Germany, Liberia, and Jamaica. That has still to happen in this very progressive equal rights nation. The earliest days of the Jesus movement recognized that equality as Jesus saw and lived it was the best thing for humankind overall. Women have pushed that reality constantly, even when extraordinary effort has been taken to silence them. We see that over and over again, that when we eliminate those things that impede human potential, when we discriminate on sex, race, religion, and lifestyle, all of society suffers. When we look at human rights as a right for all, then we see economic growth flourishing. Throwing out old role models, old job models have now allowed brilliant women to be scientists and astounding men to be caretakers. Physical and mental health flourishes when the fear of gender-based crime decreases. Healthier families flourish when children see parents living the potential that they have. A better educated society moves us forward to greater discoveries that bring us closer to the potential God intended. The voices of women in Scripture and their counterparts throughout history spur us to be more than we think we can be. They enlighten us as to what it is we are meant to be. They tell us we have the power and the strength, in spite of sometimes tremendous odds, to make things just for all. Hopefully we're listening, because we still have a long way to go on this front, because justice and freedom is still a long ways off for most women in the world, as well as many, many others. And because all of society becomes a victim when even one person in our society is harmed. Our study ends today, but hopefully our learning doesn't. And this list of resources that I've given you will allow for some further study on these topics and others. And they're some really, really good materials. But don't hesitate to look at others. There's a lot of good material out there about our faith, our history, excellent scholarship. Seek it out. Be willing to challenge yourselves to a broader way of thinking. Consider this an opportunity to prevent that intellectual suicide the Vatican II talked about. So as we continue on our way during this Easter season, my prayer for all of us is that we will have an ever greater opening of heart and mind to the New Testament culture that we aspire to be a part of, to be enlightened women and men who will not let the voices of wisdom and courage be silenced or lost for anyone. On that note, God bless.